Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to the Springs Calvary Chapel. My name is Jeff. I have the privilege of getting to introduce our guest speaker. And as we were talking about asking William to come out, Julie and I, it seems like every day we would be talking about what's going on and just open up the newspaper or the news feed and shaking our heads. And every day we're saying, this is a spiritual battle. Amen. So I wanted to start with Ephesians Chapter 6, starting in verse 10. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of the world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Therefore, take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, taking the shield of faith, where you shall be able to quench the fiery darts of the wicked, and take the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereto with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints. Will you bow your hearts with me as we pray for the service? Dear Jesus, we just thank you for this glorious day, the glorious sunshine. We thank you for the many blessings that you provide. We just ask that you would be with us tonight, that your presence would be felt, that you would speak through William, that you would open up our ears to hear and our hearts to understand. And we just ask you here today. We pray these things in Jesus' name, and all God's people said, Amen. So I've had the pleasure of spending the week with William, and I can tell you we are going to be blessed tonight. He is certainly a mighty man of God and doing the Lord's work. I'd read his bio, but it would take up the entire time that we have. So I'll just do a brief introduction. William Federer is a nationally known speaker, best-selling author, and president of AmeriSearch Incorporated, a publishing company dedicated to researching America's noble heritage. Bill's American Minute radio feature is broadcast daily across America and on the internet. His Faith and History television airs on the TCT network on stations across America via DirecTV. He's a prolific author, and when they said that Wednesday, as I was unloading his books and had to carry them around, I definitely understand what prolific means. So there's plenty of material that's available for purchase. I would encourage you to pick up some things. But what I love about it is every page that you turn, you're digging through nuggets and gems of information, and it's just it's precious information. But I think that most importantly, I've gained a new friend. And so I'd like to ask William Federer to share with us tonight.
Thank you, Jeff and Julie, and I want to let you know how much I'm impressed with your pastor, Mike Yost, and his wife, Cheryl, right? And we got a chance to hear all the stories of what the Lord has done with them in the Philippines and all over, and wow, you have a tremendous pastor right here. I'm so very, very blessed. Join me in thanking the Lord for your pastor. Yeah. Well, I send out a daily email called American Minute, and you can sign up on my website, which is AmericanMinute.com. And I have a, let's see here, there's the website. And tonight I'm going to talk about the book Socialism, the real history from Plato to the present, how the deep state capitalizes on crises to consolidate control. And I do have a flash drive with about a dozen of my presentations on it as videos, as MP4 files, so you can watch them on your computer, since DVDs are beginning to go out of style. And well, with that, let me jump in. Now, Plato lived 380 BC in Athens, Greece, and he writes, why do we talk about him? He's the first one that talked about everybody owning everything in common. And it sounds great until you think it through. Somebody is in the government handing out all this common stuff, and they're always going to be tempted to give a little bit extra to their family and friends on the side, and hold back from somebody they just don't like, and before you know it, it gets discretionary. And the saying is, he who holds the purse strings has the power. And so every attempt at everybody owning everything equally winds up with a deep state bureaucracy that's in charge of handing it all out, ruled by the most corrupt politician at the top, and you have a dictatorship. Well, Plato, 380 BC in Athens, and he writes in passing of Atlantis, this highly structured civilization on an island that sinks in the sea. And whether it existed or not, he thought that it did. And he actually dates it as about 800 years before him. Right? So he's 380 BC and 800 years before that. Now there is an island in the Mediterranean called Santorini. And it's what's left of a volcano. And I actually visited it in college. It's this nice little Greek town along the edge of this volcanic crater. And when it blew up, it would have sent a tsunami across the Mediterranean, wiping out lots of civilizations. But Plato considered Atlantis the ideal structured society. Everybody say structured. And Plato considered democracy an unstructured society. Everybody say unstructured. Demos means people, krasi means rule, so in a democracy the people rule, and the chief characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's wonderful. And then they begin to tolerate people that are a little bit off. And then they begin to tolerate people that are a lot off. And then Plato says the state is like a bazaar at which you could buy anything, like a piece of embroidery with the greatest variety of human natures. Such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless, various sort of government, a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder. And so then they begin to tolerate disorder in their personal lives. The manner of life is that of Democrats. Now he's describing a democracy. He says every man does what is right in his own eyes. So they're tolerating everybody doing anything. And the father gets accustomed to descend to the level of his son in fear, the son having no shame or fear of his parents. So they're tolerating disrespect in the home. The teacher fears and flatters his students, and the students despise their masters and tutors, so now they're tolerating disrespect in the classroom. And then they begin to tolerate financial irresponsibility, and they vote to take the money from the city treasury and spread the wealth around. Now the treasury's empty. And then it's democracy, they vote to take the money from the rich people. And he says the leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people, so now there's no rich left. And then they tolerate immorality in their personal lives. It says the young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime, not excepting incest or any other unnatural union. He's parted company with all shame. Yes, that's what he's talking about. Matter of fact, a study was done by an Oxford anthropologist named J.D. Unwin, and he wrote a book in 1934 called Sex and Culture. And he observed 80 major civilizations, including Athens, over 5,000 years of recorded history. And he saw trends. And one of the trends he saw was that sexual promiscuity and loosening of sexual restraints always precedes civilizational collapse. And so he said that civilizations go through 4 stages. The first is a period of pain and poverty. They go through war, they go through famine, they survive, and they work hard. And they work together. And they end up becoming productive and patriotic. And then they finally become prosperous. And they want to enjoy their prosperity and have a little pleasure, and then they get promiscuous and indulgent, undisciplined, lawless, and weakened, and conquered by the next rising civilization. It's sort of like an athlete. When he's young, he's focused and disciplined, watches his diet, exercises, he wants that championship. And finally he gets it, he wins. and he's the champ for a couple seasons, and then he gets a little lazy, doesn't exercise as much, eats a little fatty foods, and he gets challenged into the ring of competition. And in his mind, he still thinks he's the tough guy. But in reality, he's a couch potato and he gets the tar knocked out of him. And so civilizations go through that same cycle. Now, J.D. Unwin is not a Christian to my knowledge, but he called it a sexual marketplace. He said when women as a whole say nothing happens unless there's a commitment, the guys say fine, they make the commitment, they go out and work hard to make their wife happy, and then little kids appear. And the guy has another emotion of being protective of his wife and family. And when all the men of the country are productive and protective, rising water floats all boats. The whole country becomes productive, protective, innovative, creative, expansionistic, even militaristic. But when the women say there does not need to be a commitment, water seeks its own level. And you'll have a bunch of guys getting pleasure-focused, hey, selfish, and focusing on their own selves, and there's fewer kids born to fill the ranks of the military. When enough of the men of the country act this way, the country gets weakened. And that's when they get conquered by the next rising civilizations that's still at that militaristic phase. And J.D. Unwin says it's irreversible. In observing all these civilizations, once they start going down the hill of sexual promiscuity, it's like a snowball that gains momentum. Why? Because human nature is on its side. It wants that pleasure. And so he says that it's irreversible and the civilization will collapse. And we're faced with the attempt to try to slow it down and reverse it. But John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue? And without virtue, there can be no political liberty. Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy? Intoxication, extravagance, vice, folly. No effort in favor of virtue is lost. Harry S. Truman worded it this way, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and anarchy. So, Athens, they tolerate each other. That's nice. Then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are a lot off. Till finally they're tolerating lawlessness. And there's random violence and crime and insecurity and people getting robbed. And then the people begin to look around for someone to fix this unstructured mess. And that's when some governor comes along and he says, I can fix it. I just need some emergency powers. Just temporarily, just some emergency powers. And then Plato says, last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he's a protector. He's full of smiles. Hey, I met him. He's really nice. And then he begins to consolidate his power, right? Because he wants to fix this mess. And it says, if any are suspected of resistance to his authority, he'll have a good pretext for destroying them. How does the protector begin to change into a tyrant? He begins to grow unpopular. So tyrants have two tools in their toolbox, fraud and force. Fraud is they will lie to you and take away your freedoms, telling them that they're doing it for your own good. But then when you begin to see through it, you begin to want to confront them. And they begin to go down in popularity. And they have a choice. Give up the power, which they're not inclined to do, because Plato called them a lover of power. Or they'll get rid of the people confronting them. And they purge their administration and their military of anybody that has virtue, anybody that has morals. All they want is yes men. And once they purge the military of anybody with morals, they use the military to force their agenda down the throats of everybody. And Plato says, standing up in the chariot of state with the reins in his hand, a tyrant absolute. And then having a mob entirely at his disposal, he's not restrained from shedding of blood, so he stirs up the mob to attack his political enemies. So, Plato said democracy is doomed to fail because it's based on the people having virtue. And people really don't have virtue. If you give them a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. Now, ancient Israel's attempt to rule themselves without a king, they were virtuous a little bit longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God. And the people were virtuous because they were accountable to God. Athens did not have that. By Plato's time, Athens had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway. And so he said, this democracy thing's based on virtue, and people are going to give up their virtue. It's just a matter of time until the satellite, like this gravity pulls the satellite back down to Earth until this thing crashes. Plato even said, if someone was born that had virtue, the world would crucify him. This is what he writes in 380 BC. If a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, and will at last be crucified. He wrote that 380 BC. So, Plato concluded that the best you could hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king. And if we give him the benefit of the doubt, let's say there is such a thing as a nice tyrant. I mean, every now and then you get a good king. And he wants to concentrate power so he can do good more efficiently. But he doesn't live forever, and at some time he has to hand all that power over to some son and grandson who's not a good ruler, but likes the power, and he begins to use it oppressively. So that's the dilemma. We get our guy in, and we say, hey, it's okay that he usurps a little bit of power because he's pushing our agenda, but what happens is the next party's going to be in control, and they're going to use that concentrated power to push their agenda. What's the Bible example? Joseph in Egypt, a godly man, concentrates power into the hands of the Pharaoh. And what did that Pharaoh do with the concentrated power? He fed the children of Israel, gave them the best land in Goshen, gave him jobs taking care of his cattle. But then there was a new Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. And he used all that concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel and even make them throw their sons in the Nile River. Right? So that's the dilemma. Every now and then you get a good guy in there and he concentrates power, and so he can do good more efficiently, but then he hands it off to the other side. Plato says that since democracy is doomed to fail, the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He's the head of gold. And his administrators and military are the arms and chest of silver. Together they make up the ruling class. And they can live a little bit better in a little bit better houses because they're the ones that are keeping everything organized, and they're the ones busy handing everything out, and everyone else is the abdomen of iron and bronze. They are the ruled class. So socialism is a structured society of a ruling class and a ruled class. Now, the ruling class, they're above the law, they're politically connected, they're supported by the commoners, they can do special things like getting their hair styled when nobody else can. I remember Nancy Pelosi that was. The ruled class. Yes, everyone is provided for, but nobody owns anything. Everything's held in common, right? And the ruling class decides who gets what. And so it's he that holds the purse strings has the power. Plato writes that there are no families in his perfect society. The government decides who gets to have children. And then the government takes the children away from the parents and brings them into the city where they're socialized, which is a process of getting them to give up their family's values and adopt the values of the ruling class and to serve the ruling class. Plato says that when the true philosophers, kings, are born in a state, they will set in order their own city, right? Set in order. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws, right? And then these kids will be taught lies, noble lies. Plato said, we want one single grand lie, which will be believed by everybody. But the lie helps the king to stay in power, and since he's the best you can hope for, because democracy is doomed to fail, that's okay to lie to all these kids. Could you imagine the government taking the kids away from the families and bringing them into schools and teaching them lies to keep the ruling class in power? Anyway, Plato's perfect society on the island of Atlantis inspired in 1516 Sir Thomas More's Island of Utopia. So this is shortly after Columbus discovers America, and these scholars in Europe are saying, gee, maybe we have an opportunity to set up perfect societies in the New World. And so the word utopia means nowhere. It's a fictitious island somewhere off the coast of South America, supposedly discovered by Amerigo Vespucci. And on this island of nowhere is, it's written as a dialogue. That's the way Plato wrote. It's a conversation between two people. One asks the question and the other answers. And so the Utopia of Sir Thomas More, it's a dialogue with someone named Hythlo Deus, which means peddler of nonsense. So we have the island of nowhere told to us by the peddler of nonsense. And on this island of Utopia, it is perfectly structured. There is upper class rulers and lower class commoners. There's free health care. There's free identical clothing. Everyone receives free welfare. There's free meals in monastic communal dining halls. Everyone lives in identical 3-story public housing. There are no locks on any doors. There's no private property. All property and goods are stored in a communal warehouse, with the ruling class deciding who gets what. There's no taverns, no ale houses, no coffee houses, no places for private gatherings. There's no privacy. Everyone is tracked everywhere you go with an internal passport. Without it, it's a lifetime of slavery. Can you imagine that? 15, 16, he's talking about everybody being tracked. The government decides everyone's careers, that you have to work the rest of your life. There's no families on Utopia. The government regulates childbearing. Very similar to China's one-child policy or Planned Parenthood's Margaret Sanger, who said no woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. Now, Sir Thomas More wrote this as a veiled criticism of Henry VIII, because he's the king that switched from Catholic to Protestant and told all of his staff they had to immediately switch with him, and Sir Thomas More didn't want to switch, and Henry VIII had him killed. So Plato's Island of Atlantis, Sir Thomas More Island of Utopia, inspired Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. He names it New Atlantis because he's directly referring to Plato's Atlantis. And in this New Atlantis, it's a fictitious island in the South Pacific. Highly structured, ruling class, commoners, more scientific careers because the scientific revolution is going on at this time. But the government dictates everything. Someone wrote a satire on this, and you've read it. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Right? Here's Gulliver, which means gullible traveler, like Hythlo Deus, and he's washed up on an island and finds out it's highly structured with a ruling class that controls every minutia of everybody's life, and then the ruling class that just has to work their jobs and do what they're told. Now, why is this important? The Pilgrims. So the Pilgrims had no money, and they went to investors in England, and they formed the London Company, and had bylaws for the company. And the bylaws for the Pilgrims said, all profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means shall remain still in ye common stock. And all are to have their meat, drink, and apparel, and all provision out of ye common stock. Well, the Pilgrims tried it and almost starved to death. Governor of the Pilgrims, William Bradford, writes, the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times. I just think this is amazing, that the Pilgrims knew that they were trying to live out Plato's perfect society. This is the governor of the Pilgrims, and he's writing this, and he talks about the emptiness of the theory of Plato. He says that the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men, who were most able and fit for service, objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the weak man, who was not able to do a quarter what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men, who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc., with the humbler and younger ones, thought it some indignity and disrespect to them. As for men's wives, who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. Bradford goes on, let none argue that this is due to human failing rather than to this communistic plan of life in itself. I answer that God in his wisdom saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn, obtain a better crop, so they might not continue to endure the misery of want. After much debate, the governor, with the chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea. You plant corn for your household. So every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means, and gave far better satisfaction. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. Right? So we have this theoretical Plato's or Thomas More's or Francis Bacon. Hey, I got an idea. Let's have everybody own everything in common. And the Pilgrims, they're the first ones to actually try to live out this theoretical stuff. And they almost starve to death. They scrap it. They give everybody their own plot of land, and they become successful. And we have days of Thanksgiving to remember that. Now, wasn't the early church socialist? Well, no, actually, the early church was the early church. Socialism is counterfeit early church. And the differences between the word, voluntary and involuntary, and church and government. So the early believers voluntarily sold their land and laid the money at the feet of the apostles for the church to distribute. They didn't have the government taking their land away and then be forced to involuntarily lay the money at the feet of Pilate for the Roman government to redistribute. Here, Pilate, here's a little more money for the Roman government. No. When the children of Israel went into the promised land, every family was given property. If you own property, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. And you can be moved upon in your heart to give away some of your stuff. The Bible called that charity. Lenin said socialism is a transition phase from capitalism to communism. Capitalism empowering the individual, communism empowering the state. Karl Marx says communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. So if you don't own property, how can you be charitable? How can you give away what you don't have? What, are you going to steal from somebody else and now you're a thief? You broke the law? No, God entrusts you with stuff, and then you have the voluntary opportunity to manifest on the outside the love of God that is in your heart. Does that make sense? Now, wasn't Jesus socialist? Jesus taught the parable of the talents. And one guy got 5, multiplied it to 10. One guy got 2, multiplied it to 4, and one guy buried it. And he said, "Sir, here is your talent. I kept it laid away in a piece of cloth." His master replied, "You wicked servant." He said to those standing by, "Take his talent away from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. "Sir," they said, "he already has 10. He replied, "I tell you that everyone who has more will be given, but as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away." If Jesus were a socialist, he would have said, take from the guy that has 10 and divide them up equally. Instead, he said, take it from that lazy guy that's never done anything with it, and give it to the guy that's going to do something with it. The hand of the diligent shall bear rule. Right? The word paraclete for the Holy Spirit means helper. You don't sit back with your feet on the couch and say, Holy Spirit, do it. No, you get out there and do it, and the Holy Spirit helps you. But you've got to do something. And God blesses you when you do something. Right? Now, there's confusion as to roles. In the Bible, God clearly gives commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. Commands to individuals, among other things, include helping the poor. Family commands are mostly relational. Husbands, love your wives. Children, submit to your parents. Business commands are do an honest day's work, don't hold back the wages. The church definitely has commands to take care of the poor, and historically they did. Feeding the widows and the orphans, and starting hospitals and medical clinics, and digging wells in villages. And I was talking to Pastor about their ministry in the Philippines, and Larissa about the ministry in Rwanda. And the Christians were always doing things, right? Do you know there's no command for the government to take care of the poor? The command to the government is the shortest. Protect the innocent, punish the guilty. Right? And defend the borders. There's no command for the government to be involved in health care. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. Historically in America, you had the Second Great Awakening revival in the early 1800s. And you had preachers like Charles Finney, who said, being a Christian is more than just going and hearing a sermon. You got to do something. And so his lectures on revival were read by someone named George Williams over in England. And he decided to do something. He started the Young Men's Christian Association, or YMCA. Another couple in England read Finney's lectures on revival, William and Catherine Booth, and they started the Salvation Army. And you had groups starting abolitionist societies to free the slaves. You had temperance societies to cut back on drinking. You had women's suffrage. You know, Clara Barton was a school teacher, and she started the Red Cross. You had individuals, right, in churches starting programs and taking care of all the domestic needs without the government's help, right? In the early 1900s, you began to see like Woodrow Wilson saying, I want to encourage everyone to donate to the Red Cross. But it wasn't the government doing the work. It was telling the government, saying, give to the Red Cross. But these were individual organizations and church organizations. It all changed with FDR and the Great Depression and the New Deal programs and the government coming in and saying, we'll give out money, we'll do this, and it created a dependency, but it usurped the church's role that traditionally took care of all the social needs. And then it got even worse with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society welfare state. And so now, a generation and a half has gone by, and the church forgot that it ever did all that stuff. But if you do some digging, 8 of the 10 largest hospital corporations in America were started by churches. Mostly the Catholic Church, but then the Baptist, Seventh-day Adventists, Lutherans, and so forth. And most of the universities were started by churches, right? And anyway, James Madison says, charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government. Davy Crockett was a congressman before he died in the Alamo. And there was a fire in Washington, D.C., burned a bunch of Georgetown. And Congress was going to take some federal tax money and help the people in Georgetown rebuild. And Davy Crockett said, no, Congress has not the power to appropriate this money as an act of charity. Every member on this floor knows it. We have the right as individuals to give away as much of our own money as we please in charity. But as members of Congress, we have no right to appropriate $1 of public money as charity. Calvin Coolidge says, it does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it. We need to take care of the poor. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job. We need to take care of the immigrants. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job. We need to start schools. Yes, we do. We need to feed the poor. We need to start schools for the poor. We need to do all that, but it's not the government's job. And prior to FDR, the government didn't do it, the churches did it. And individuals would get an idea and they would start a little organization, right? Somebody would start the Boy Scouts and somebody else would start the Girl Scouts. Everybody would start organizations without the government. Gerald Ford said, people say, why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money? I look them in the eye and say, do you realize that a government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have? Now what if older fish could tell younger fish to stay away from shiny things dangling in the water? But they can't. So every new generation of younger fish sees that shiny fishing lure and they're caught. Socialism is a shiny thing dangling in the water. Free food, free clothes, free education, free welfare. Free is attractive, but there's a hook there. You're giving up your independence. You're giving up control of your life. Now, whenever the church helps anybody, it is called disinterested benevolence. You're helping them just to helping them, expecting nothing in return. And if they get better off, then hopefully they can help the next needy person that comes along. Whenever the government helps anybody, it's always in exchange for something. Right? You're in Egypt, you need food, and the government says, we'll give you food, but it's in exchange for your cattle, your land, your children, your lives, your votes, right? When the church helps, it's personal. The giver feels the joy of the Lord, of God using them to meet the need of a person. And the recipient feels the love of God through a real person. And they're grateful, and a relationship is established, and they end up building the body of Christ. Whenever the government helps anybody, it is always impersonal. You don't know whose pocketbook that money came out of that turned into the welfare check that you got in the mail. And you really don't care. And instead of being grateful, it becomes a debt that is owed, and if it's delayed, the recipient gets irate. And then, over time, the recipient begins to lose self-esteem. They see other people working and being successful, and they know they're just relying on this check, and they begin to feel bad about themselves. And they want to channel that bad feeling somewhere. They want to blame somebody. They end up blaming the very government giving them free stuff. They end up hating the very government giving them free stuff. It's a strange dynamic. So back to the Pilgrims. They switched from company to covenant, which is a switch from involuntary to voluntary. So instead of your neighbor being taken care of because the bylaws say that all the stuff's going to be taken care of and somebody's going to distribute it, what happens is voluntarily the Lord entrusts you with stuff, and then you voluntarily take care of your neighbor because you're doing it as unto God. This is called a covenant form of government. And the Pilgrims and Puritans got the idea from ancient Israel. And it's like a triangle. You get rights and blessings from God, and you voluntarily take care of your neighbor because you're doing it as unto God. It's all voluntary. Voluntary is sort of a big deal with God. You know, when you think about it, He makes everything, and everything follows rules. Right? Laws of planetary motion, laws of gravity, laws of optics, and little puppy dogs, they're following instinct. I mean, you know, and all the animals, everything follows what they're programmed to do. And God's like, okay, you know, been there, done that. I want to make somebody that has free will. Right? We have the choice. And so free will is sort of, so He has the Moses and the children of Israel in the wilderness. And He says, whoever's heart is moved can bring stuff to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. So they bring purple cloth and gold and all this kind of stuff. And then finally they say, okay, wait, we have enough. But it was voluntary. And then David is collecting stuff for his son Solomon to build the temple. And he gets 3,000 talents of gold, and he gets the leaders together and says, what are you guys going to give? And they pitch in 5,000. And then he says, God, everything we have is yours. We're just giving back to you what you gave to us. But it's voluntary. God wants to build His temple voluntary. It says in Psalms 110, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. Right? So He's really into building His kingdom through you voluntarily yielding to Him and letting Him do His will through you. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said the Decalogue, 10 Commandments, are addressed to each and every person. This is the origin of the sanctity of the individual. Your founding fathers came over with that. They looked after one another, not only as a matter of necessity, but as a matter of duty to their God. No other country in the world started that way. Well, there was one other country, and it was ancient Israel. So, America, you have the pastors in New England, and they study the Bible, and they study, in particular, that first 400-year period when Israel came out of Egypt, before they got King Saul. It's called the Hebrew Republic, and it was the first time in world history where you have a nation with millions of people and no king. Right? For 400 years, they didn't have a king. You don't appreciate it until I spent several years, and I wrote about it in some of my other books, where I studied every single century of recorded human history. Writing of records began around 3300 BC with Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. Right? Today that's Iraq. And from that time on, you have kings. Pharaohs, Caesars, Kaisers, Sultans, Tsars, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, and they keep getting bigger because with military advancements, the king can kill more people. Until finally the King of England had the biggest. He was a globalist, a one-world government guy. Sun never set on the British Empire. And America's founders decided they didn't like this globalist king telling us what to do, so they broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. Where did our founders get the idea from? The New England pastors. Where did they get it from? The Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400 years out of Egypt before they got King Saul. And matter of fact, they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. This is Yale's coat of arms. It still has, to this day, Hebrew characters on it. Truth and light. So here's Israel. Everyone in Israel is taught the law. Everyone's given private property and so forth. And so if you think of power, government power, as a line, one side is total government, the other side is no government. Total government, you get a king. He rules through fear. You do what he says or he kills you. The other side is no government. That would be anarchy, unless the people have virtue. What's virtue? That's where they all have internal morals. And like in Israel's case, they're all taught the Ten Commandments. I was trying to think of a way of explaining it. Imagine if everyone downloads a behavioral app on their iPhone. Instead of a GPS app telling you where to turn, imagine a behavioral app, right? Now, where do you go? And you download it. And the Levites were the computer geeks that help you to download this app. Right? And so you've downloaded this app, you have it on your phone, and it's sensing your blood pressure, and it sees that you're with somebody, and it can hear the volume on your voice, and it sees that you're about to lose your temper and blow it, and then yell at the person, and it says, alert, alert, don't lose your temper. Right? And then this app checks your bank account, sees it's getting a little low, and sees you're in a store with lots of expensive stuff because it knows all the prices, and it sees there's nobody else in the vicinity, and you're looking a little bit extra too long, and it runs this algorithm that you're being tempted to steal it, and it says, alert, alert, don't steal. So imagine you're carrying around this behavioral app with you. And so that's what the law was. For ancient Israel, everybody was taught the law. And the Levites were the computer geeks that helped you to download this app. But the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Ancient Israel had the key ingredient. There's a God who's watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. You're about to steal, nobody's around, you know you can get away with it. And then you think, God's watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country really believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. Maximum liberty. Women can go anywhere without fear. You don't have to lock anything. I mean, everything. Because everybody thinks, okay, I want to be fair. God's watching me. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Okay. Now, God knew the Israelites would sin, and rather than them walk around the rest of their life with a guilty conscience, once a year they had the Day of Atonement, and everyone's sins in the whole country were forgiven for the past year, and they start off the new year with a clean slate. And this is foreshadowing Jesus. He is our atonement, not just once a year, but once forever. He died on the cross to pay for our sins, and we approach this perfect God through the Lamb. Ronald Reagan said, without God, there's no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. If there's no God, laws are just made up by a bunch of old men. Why follow them? Yeah, some will as long as it's socially acceptable, like Plato, as long as everybody's got virtue. But then some people are going to realize, hey, I can steal, I can, right? And then before you know it, it turns into lawlessness. So ancient Israel's situation was, they had the priests, priests stopped teaching the law. You said they did? Yeah. And then once they stopped teaching it, then it turned into this chaos. And so you got Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. I mean, you're the high priest not even teaching the law to his kids. And then you have the Levite with a graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. And the tribe of Dan comes along and steals the graven image and tells this Levite, come along with us. You can be a priest to our whole tribe. And you're reading the story saying, what's this Levite doing with a graven image? Isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them? Right? So the Levites weren't teaching the law. And then this terrible story, the Levite with the concubine. And the law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is, he's with a woman he's not even married to, so he's not following the law. And they're in a house, and the house is surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the very last stages of a people ruling themselves, right? This casting off of self-restraint, abandonment of passion. Remember J.D. Unwin said that one of the last stages, sexual promiscuity always precedes civilizational decline. And so then you read this line in the Bible, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priest had stopped teaching what was right in the Lord's eyes. Right? So this is almost the exact same line that Plato used. Now Plato was about 600 years later. Right? So this is around, 1000 BC, and Plato was around 300 or so BC. So what happened? Ancient Israel turns into an unstructured mess. And the people begin to say, can't some governor come along and fix this mess? And they go to Samuel the prophet, and they say, the self-government system's not working anymore. We want to be like all the other countries. We want a king. Right? And Samuel cries, and the Lord tells him, they have not rejected thee, but they've rejected me, that I should not reign over them. And so they get a king. Now the people said, we sinned, right? So then a storm comes, and lightning destroys their crops, and the people said, we sinned in asking for a king. And they said, yeah, you did sin, but God will still work his plan of redemption, which he did. Well, let's look at another story. So Saul is now the king, and he is pouting that his son Jonathan became friends with David. And he turns to his soldiers, and he goes, none of you soldiers care about me. And one soldier, Doeg the Edomite, says, King, I care about you. I saw David go to this town, and the priests gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath. And Saul says, bring those priests to me. The priests show up, and Saul tells his soldiers to kill him. And the soldiers hesitate. And Doeg the Edomite says, I'll kill him, goes out there and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers had been operating under the old system, where everybody's accountable to God and follow the law. And the law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you kill anybody. There's only one witness, Doeg. So the soldiers are hesitating. Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. Right? You tell me to kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill it. Tell me there's no more marriage. Whatever the government tells me, I'm just a bunch of mush. Right? And so whenever the government, a dictator comes in, a tyrant, he wants to insert himself between you and God. He wants to dictate morality to you. And God's jealous. He doesn't want somebody between you and him. And anyway, so the pilgrim got their idea from ancient Israel, the idea of a covenant where you get rights and blessings from God, and you voluntarily take care of your neighbor because you personally are accountable to God. I'm going to go through 3 more slides, and we can see the transition of covenant to social contract to socialism. So, century after the Pilgrims, covenant turns into social contract during the Age of Enlightenment. And this comes out of the scientific revolution, where you have Sir Isaac Newton discovering laws of gravity, laws of optics, Kepler discovering laws of planetary motion, Robert Boyle discovering laws of pressure. And so some theologians said maybe God made everything with laws. And like a guy makes a clock and winds it up and sets it on a shelf and goes off for a walk. Yeah, maybe God made everything, but he's not involved. He's distant. He's impersonal. The ultimate of this is God is an impersonal force in the universe, right? And so we go from pilgrim covenant with a personal God to the Age of Enlightenment social contract with a distant God. Next century, it's social contract with no God during the French Revolution. You get your rights from the group, you're accountable to the group. Social compact, right? And the next century it turns into Marxism and socialism, where the state is God. So, let's go through the Pilgrims to the social contract, Age of Enlightenment to the French Revolution. So let's look at the French Revolution. You have a king named Louis the 16th. He's nice. He sent his navy to help us win the Revolutionary War. Well, after the Revolutionary War, you know what France got in return for helping us? Nothing, but debt. And then their crops failed. And then the people didn't have bread. And they go to Queen Marie Antoinette. She says, let them eat cake. She just grew up in court. She didn't know what was going on. Anyway, so the people of France thought if they could just chop off the king and queen's heads, all of their problems will be solved. And so they chop them off, and it doesn't get any better. So then they chop off the heads of all the royalty, and it doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of all the wealthy. You have money, we don't, you're selfish. You must have gotten that money the wrong way. And then they chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers, and it doesn't get any better. You got food and supplies, we don't, you're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the hoarders. You got extra food, we don't have enough, you're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the clergy, because they're speaking out against all the head chopping off stuff. Somehow they're to blame. Then they chop off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it. 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris, France. They even invented a nice clean machine to do it with called the guillotine. Do you know what the motto of the French Revolution was? Liberty, equality, fraternity. Liberty, it sounds nice, except it doesn't work. Liberty is experienced individually. Fraternity is their word for socialism. It's the fraternity, the club, the collective, the group, the mob, the state. And equality can be understood two ways. In America, it was equal treatment before the law. In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternity, the group, the collective, thinks you have too much stuff, it can use the power of the state to trample your individual liberties, take away all your stuff, redistribute it, and kill you. So the rights of the collective always overrule the rights of the individual. So it sounds like a nice thing, but there really isn't any liberty. And so when this is going on, and they're chopping off all the heads in Paris, in America you have Timothy Dwight, and he's the president of Yale, and he says, you know, prior to our revolution, we had a Great Awakening revival, but prior to the French Revolution, they got rid of God. He says about the year 1728, Voltaire, so celebrated for his wit and his hatred of Christianity, formed a systematical design to destroy Christianity and to introduce in its stead a general diffusion of irreligion and atheism. The being of God was denied and ridiculed. Possession of property was pronounced robbery. You got property, you got stuff, you must have taken it from somebody. Chastity, natural affection were declared to be nothing more than groundless prejudices. Right? So here we're back into the promiscuity. Adultery, assassination, poisonings, and crimes of other like infernal nature were taught as lawful, provided the end was good. So it's okay to smash windows of people with stores if you're pushing your agenda. And then Timothy Dwight talks about France, the education of youth, books replete with infidelity, irreligion, immorality, and obscenity. To destroy us, therefore, our enemies must first destroy our Sabbath and seduce us from the house of God. In other words, we first have to get rid of people thinking about God, then you get rid of the law, then it turns into chaos, and then the rubber band snaps into the hands of a king. So we have this model. Democracies and republics are based on the people having morals and virtue. But they give up the morals and virtue, it turns into chaos, and out of that chaos, they want somebody to come along and fix it, and the rubber band snaps back into the hands of the king. Right? Now in France during this time, it's called the Reign of Terror, they tear down statues. Like they tore down the statue of good King Henry IV. He's the guy that tried to patch up Protestants and Catholics. And then they dig up the bones of St. Genevieve. Here is, who is she? 450 AD, Attila the Hun, with an army of 500,000 men, is wiping out city after city in Europe. And he's headed toward Paris. And Genevieve gets everyone in Paris to fast and pray. And for some reason, Attila skips sacking Paris. So she's considered the patron saint of Paris. During the French Revolution, they dig up the bones of St. Genevieve and trash them. Why would you do this? Why do you want to destroy history? It's called deconstruction. And it's, every conquering country does it, where you portray the founders of a country negatively so that people emotionally detach from them. And then you get people in a neutral position where they're open-minded, and then you give them a pitch positively for whatever future you have planned for them. It's a sales technique. So if I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is tell you negative things about the toothpaste you're currently brushing with. You're still brushing with that stuff? Haven't you read that it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? Ooh, you're repulsed by it. Now I have you in a neutral position, you're open-minded, what are all the toothpaste out there? And then I give you my pitch for this brand new target control breath freshening toothpaste, right? So it's a drive neutral reverse. It's a gene replacement therapy for a culture. Take out the old identity, put in the new. And so that's what they do. They go into the classrooms and they tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians, they sold people into slavery, they were chauvinists. Forget the fact that they gave you a country where you're in charge of your life. And these kids are like repulsed by the founding fathers. Now you got the kids in a neutral. They're open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there? Then you give them your pitch for LGBT or socialism or Sharia. Right? And this is what happened in Europe. So Europe went from 1,000 years of Catholic cathedrals and Protestant Reformation and Jewish neighborhoods to a secular Europe with the French Revolution, free sex, anything goes, and now it's turning into Sharia socialist Europe, with Mohammed being the #1 name for newborns. And yeah, the government pays for everyone's education, but the government determines your career. Right? If you are a kid and you score bad on a couple tests, the government channels you into career paths. You get a little older, you decide, hey, I want to really be a doctor. I'm going to study real good. So sorry, you can't go that way. You scored bad on this test. Well, but I really want to try. No, you can't. And I've known people that have grown up in Europe, and they at first weren't applying themselves, and then they later wanted to, and it was shut off. There was no funding. They were not allowed. So, French Revolution. So they're chopping off all these heads, and they wanted to erase Judeo-Christian influence. And so religious monuments were destroyed, graves desecrated, religious meetings prohibited, churches closed, Christian schools banned, church education outlawed, no public or private worship allowed. They even killed nuns. The nuns did the hospital stuff. The oldest hospital in Europe is called the Hotel Dieu, and it's right next door to Notre Dame Cathedral. It was started in 660 AD by Christians. And so these nuns started so many hospitals that the nun hat turned into the nurse's hat. You know, the nurses used to wear that little hat? That came from the nun's habit. And so the nuns were like the most, even Florence Nightingale, who was the lady with the lamp during the Battle of Crimea in the 1850s in Europe. You know, she's a pioneer of nursing. She said there's no training for a healthcare better than that of a Catholic nun. Right? So it was sort of synonymous. She got it done, she did healthcare. But it was a bit more convalescent type infirmary stuff, but nevertheless they did it. Well, during the French Revolution, they wanted these nuns to give up their Christian faith, and they wouldn't. So they lined them up to the guillotine, and they were singing their church song, and they would chop off their heads. And there'd be one less person singing. Then they would chop off some more heads. Less people singing. Then they finally chop off the last head, nobody else is singing. Could you imagine the government, like, when they were pushing through Obamacare, that these little sisters of the poor who had taken vows of chastity and they didn't want to support abortions, and they had to go to the Supreme Court twice. Right? Here they are saying, you got to give up your religious convictions. So during this time, you have Robespierre, and he's the head of their French Assembly. I apologize, this keeps slipping here. He said, lead the people by terror. Basis of popular government during a revolution is terror. Terror is nothing more than swift, severe, inflexible justice. Could you imagine the government terrorizing its own people? Wow. So this time, Robespierre, by the way, every day he'd come out with a new list of people to be investigated for being disloyal to the new government, right? The new administration. And he'd sort of have a list of names, and they would go out and round up those names and chop off their heads. And then he'd come out with another list of people to be investigated. We need to have it. We need to detain them. We need to put that. They were involved in an insurrection. We need to lock them up. And priests and ministers, those who harbored them, were executed on sight. So even if you were caught housing a pastor, a similar thing happened in Mexico in 1917. Then there's a rural area. They're way out in the country. They're far away from the capital. They think they're safe. It's called the Vendee. And 300,000 are killed by this federal army that comes into town. Men, women, and children. It's considered the first modern genocide. And it became the model for every socialist revolution since. Kill off the old order so that you can do your new liberty, equality, fraternity, right? Matter of fact, Robespierre put a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covers her with a sheet, said this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. They don't even want done in the year of the Lord, like our Constitution. So they make 1792 the new year one of the Republic. They don't even want a 7-day week because it goes to the Bible. So they come up with a 10-day week. Each day had 10 hours. Each hour had 100 minutes. Each minute had 100 seconds. They said 10 was the number of man because you count with 10 fingers. So they made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. So during this time, there's no God. It's just the mob that this guy decides who's going to die today, who's not going to die. And so there's no right, there's no wrong. It's just the mob. And out of this mess, you get Napoleon. Right? So democracies and republics where the people don't have morals and virtue turns into chaos. And out of that chaos, people want someone to come along and fix it. And you get a dictator. Well, in France's case, the dictator was Napoleon. And now Napoleon conquers across Europe, 6 million die, and afterwards the king of Prussia said we can't get conquered that easy again, we need to strengthen the state. And so the king of Prussia gets a philosopher named Hegel, who teaches at the University of Berlin. And I'll tell you about him in a minute. So we go through these 4 slides, right? So we got covenant with a personal God, social contract with an impersonal God, and then French Revolution, a social contract with no God, to Marxism and socialism where the state is God. And so Hegel said the state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. All the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state. Rousseau, who wrote the social contract, said when the state says to a citizen, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die, because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. So the state decides your worth. 100 years later in Germany, says Nazi Ministry of Justice authorized physicians to end the sufferings of incurable patients. No life still valuable to the state will be wantonly destroyed. And then you have Pol Pot, communist Cambodia, kills 1/3 of his own country. He says, to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss. Your life is only valuable if you help me get power. So again, Pilgrim Covenant, Age of Enlightenment, distant God, French Revolution, no God, socialism, state is God. Hegel said the state recognizes no authority but its own. It acknowledges no abstract rules of good and bad. What's an abstract rule of good and bad? Like the 10 Commandments? Yeah, the state doesn't acknowledge any limits. It's just a power grab, and if you help the state grab power, the state thinks your life is useful to it. And if you challenge the state's power, it'll use its power to crush you. Matter of fact, this is what, during the Nuremberg trials, when they were prosecuting these Nazis for killing Jews, the Nazi officer said, we were just following the laws of our state. And the state's the highest power. And our state said that it was okay to kill them. And here the prosecutor's like, no, there's a power higher than the state. They're trying to figure out, how do we say it? Eisenhower said, in many lands, the state claims to be the author of human rights. If the state gives rights, it can and inevitably will take away those rights. The Founding Fathers had to refer to the Creator in order to make their revolutionary experiment make sense. In other words, do your rights come from the government or do they come from the source higher than the government? Right? If our founders said our rights come from God, and therefore the government's job is to protect and guarantee to you your Creator-given rights. But if there is no Creator, your rights come from the government, the social contract, right? The collective, the group, the mob, the fraternity. And what the government giveth, the government can taketh awayeth. Eisenhower said it's because all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that men could dare to be free. we claimed that the king was infringing on our God-given rights, and therefore we were justified in breaking away from the king. Well, now, that's the first part of my book, right? And so the title of the book is Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. And the subtitle is How the Deep State Capitalizes on Crises to Consolidate Control. And it's very interesting, and I'm going to get into it, but I didn't know if you want to take a break for a few minutes to use the restroom and maybe look at the books on the table. Would you like to do that?
Yes.
All right, so we'll do that for a few minutes and then maybe come back in 10 minutes. Is that all right? Did you get anything out of this?